The U.S. was, is, and remains the world's reserve currency. On October 18th, it'll be the world's reserve currency. The investors still demand U.S. Securities as a safe haven. We saw that when the downgrade happened.
But should they demand the U.S. Treasuries as a safe haven on October 18th if they can't pass a deal?
I certainly think the short-term machinations are something that we should be concerned about, but not for the short term, for the long term. I think we chip away at the U.S.'s credibility, both when we see this craziness in Washington, as well as when you see the rating agencies are fighting over who can, come up with this aspect of, of the short-term issue or this aspect of the short-term.
One thing that's so cool about you is you've actually worked at a number of these agencies, S&P and Fitch as well. I think to a lot of people watching and listening, it's what do they really do? You go to lunch, you come back. What do you do at a rating agency?
They eat lunch. I'm
so glad that you think it's cool. I've never heard anyone say that, so I'm going to use that from now on.
What do you do?
Well, if you look back at, let's talk about the ratings, sovereign ratings. Sovereign ratings really came about years ago to give a framework for rating institutions abroad, particularly banks.
Right.
Today, it's used by the rating agencies to scold politicians and they've sort of lost sight, particularly when it comes to the U.S. Because as the reserve currency of the world, you really have to look at the U.S. differently. They have an enormous demand for their treasuries, even when you see this sort of craziness going on in Washington. But the issue is that long term, as the rating agencies miss the point and as politicians continue to use these points to argue political issues, it's going to chip away at our credibility.
To Steve Forbes' point, I'm going to speak for you, Mr. Forbes, right here. It's a $16 trillion economy, and all we're talking about is the will to act, political will. Is that part of the ratings
It was
calculation?
part of S&P's.
It is. But I think that S&P took it as a short-term measure, and really the will is long-term. It really should be looked at over a longer period of time. The U.S. is still AAA, and I'll give you a great example. If S&P felt strongly about the downgrade, how is it that they're rating AAA mortgage-backed bonds? So you're telling me that 500 U.S. families' balance sheets is more credible than the U.S. government? It makes no sense. So unless you're going to use that as a measure and really have an impact on how you rate everything in the United States, because it acts as sort of a ceiling, it loses its effectiveness.
James, there are a lot of question marks out there over exactly what criteria is being used to consider the U.S.'s credit rating. Rand Paul spoke on CNN's State of the Union. He made some interesting comments. Let's listen first.
People have to realize that not raising the debt ceiling means you have to balance your budget. It doesn't mean you default. And people are conflating these two, and they're not the same thing.
He also made the point that the concern is not so much over the threat of default, but the size of the U.S.'s debt. Does that make sense to you?
The size of the U.S. debt is always something that you look at, but it's more problematic when you're not the reserve currency of the world, because, again, you use different metrics. I go back to August of 2011, when the U.S. was downgraded by S&P. What we saw the next day was a flight into treasuries. And I think that that's counter to what you would have expected had there been real concern about the U.S. deficit or the size of the U.S. debt.
And the other factor here is that the ratings companies are for profit, so there is a little bit of
questionable about motive.
That's right. And they're coming off, they're coming off of being smacked around over the subprime crisis.